to a panel on grounded resistance and resilience to U.S. political violence, a national conversation on faith-rooted peace building. Thank you for coming to attend this timely and important conversation. And incredibly grateful to Reverend Tim Schaefer of First Baptist Church. He is actually working the camera up above, and so I extend greetings on his behalf. Why are we having this panel? The opening remarks that I had were different when I had emailed them to the panelists on Friday afternoon. And the world changed. Actually, the world does change every day if we want to be very honest about our situations in which we find ourselves in. This is a pertinent conversation, yes, but in light of recent events in Pennsylvania, yes. But if we want to tell ourselves the truth, we also have to look at the history of the United States in its entirety, where many populations have actually endured political violence, and that violence and those conversations have not come to the forefront of dominant narratives. And so, yes, what happened in Pennsylvania is very important for the conversation that we're having, but if we're also looking at the trajectory of US history, this conversation has needed to happen over and over and over again. And so that is why we're having this panel. We're also having this panel to present a peaceful narrative and a counter-narrative. There has been a lot of vitriol, and it's not just in recent years and in recent months and in recent days, but also looking at political conversations and how that impacts people of faith. There are some people of faith who benefit from what is happening in the United States, but we also have to acknowledge that there are many people of faith who are being sidelined and who are being marginalized, and that is happening through political violence. We're also coming together as people who are interested in not just the conversation around, but one of the reasons for this panel is looking for tactile ways in which we can engage in peacemaking and peace building when we are rooted in our faith. And we are here because this panel is in alignment with Faith and Public Life's mission to advance the moral imperative for a just and equitable country that allows for each of us to live into our full humanity. We do this by building power and cultures of belonging among diverse, influential faith leaders, and resourcing them to expand the narrative on the vision for our democracy. So today, we are expanding that narrative. For our time together, I do want to give a setup of how this panel will be going. And so there will be an opening for all of the panelists, an opening question, and then each panelist has a prepared question. And then after that individual question, panelists will have an opportunity to interact and to converse with one another. There will then be a concluding question for all panelists, and then we will be holding audience questions until the end with a Q&A between the audience and the panelists. So with that, let us meet our panelists. And they are listed in your program, but I would love for the panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Margulis. I am the founder and immediate past executive director of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice. I'm currently the interim rabbi at Beth Hillel Temple in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And I'm here today at the invitation of Truah, the Rabbinic call for justice, as one of their member rabbis.
Good afternoon. Right? Morning still. Good morning. Pardeep, Kaleka. I'm a senior anti-hate advisor for a couple different outlets, but mainly for a group called Not in Our Town, which is based out of Oakland and has done work for the past 25 years on how to help communities become more resilient against hate and what we call targeted violence right now. I'm also a member of the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin in Oak Creek. In 2012, my father and 6 others were murdered by at that time, an affiliated white supremacist. And over the past 12 years, been just blessed to work with faith communities on how do we really restore sanctuary in the aftermath of hate.
Good morning. My name is Imam Makram, El-Amin. I am from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I lead Masjid, Al-Nur, Muslim mosque in North Minneapolis for the last 25 years plus. We're also head of what's called El-Maa'uun, which is our community outreach services where we do work around housing, food justice, employment, and mentoring. Very excited about this conversation. As was just mentioned, long overdue conversation, and I'm hoping to engage the audience today. So thank you for being here.
Good morning. I am Reverend Breanna, Illene, and I'm the Director of Ecumenical Innovation and Justice Initiatives at the Wisconsin Council of Churches. We bring together 21 traditions, about 2,000 churches, and 1 million Christians across the state of Wisconsin, leaning towards courage, justice, and holy imagination.
Listed in your program for the panel is also the Reverend Mark Thompson, who is with the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. Due to scheduling delays, Reverend Thompson is unable to join us, but he also sends his greetings. All right, the first question for all panelists. Tomorrow, yes, we're already looking towards the future. Tomorrow is the John Lewis Day of Action, where a number of faith-based groups will be participating in events around the country that will be focused on voting rights. Also realizing that this day is coming in the midst of contested voting rights. Who has access to vote? How can they vote? And how to make voting a peaceful process. Thinking about the tensions experienced in this current political climate, how should faith leaders prepare, both personally and with their communities, to continue to engage in resilience and faith-rooted peace building in this election season?
So on Saturday, our worst fears were realized as there was political violence at a rally for President Trump. And we really owe a debt of gratitude to the Secret Service for their swift actions, that there wasn't greater carnage. But there was somebody in the crowd who was killed and 2 people who were grievously injured. And our hearts go out to President Trump and gratitude that he was not harmed any further. And our hearts go out to the families of those whose lives were lost and who were injured. As faith leaders, it's our responsibility to make sure that we respond to these moments with empathy, that we unite against violence in word and in deed, and remind all of us that no matter what our political differences are, we're all united in our love for our country and our commitment to democracy. I believe we have to give people positive things to focus on, proactive actions that they can take to protect democracy. We have to give people a vision of a better future that we can all build together. When we focus so much on what is broken and we stoke fears and we lean into people's anxieties, we give people more reason to stay home, to climb into bed, to pull the covers over their ears, and to disconnect. We have to be real with people. We have to recognize their anxieties and their fears and the brokenness. But as faith leaders, we also have to offer words of nechemta, words of comfort. In the Hebrew Bible, the prophets stand on the street corners and they rail against the people for their misbehavior, and they prophesy all kinds of doom and gloom that's going to come to them because they're not behaving the way God wants them to behave. But at every moment, the prophets end with a word of nechemta, a word of comfort, a vision of a time when strife, when violence, when discord will pass, and when there will be a return to a time of peace. But that doesn't happen on its own. It's something that we all have to work on together, and I think that's our responsibility as faith leaders, to bring people together.
Thank you, Rabbi Bonnie. And I think I'm just going to talk about the other part of that. When we think about empathy and we think about the opposite, which becomes apathy, which is, I don't care. And I think that there's a lot of communities that exist and have existed for a very long time, whether that voting was not sanctioned or not supported by the policies, or whether it wasn't supported by the psychology or the mindset of, does my voice really even matter? Will the way that things exist just always kind of be the way that they're going to be? Will the people that don't have power or nor participation never have it? And I think for us in our communities, we think about this sort of election and elections as they go forward as very, very participatory. And we think about faith, and we know that faith comes with a sense of courage to face those times and really say, you know what, sometimes when I don't feel like my voice matters, I'm going to participate anyways. Because I know that I'm doing this on behalf of not just my generation, but the generations that come after me. And, you know, I think looking at what happened in Pennsylvania, right, there are people who understand how important these elections are. There are reasons why we struggle and we have conflict, and even at some point there is violence that is associated to politics. And so it calls on all of us to really encourage that part of us that says, you know what, I care, and I care about this next election, and I will participate in the elections going forward.
When I was in elementary school, I can remember being frustrated in my class and getting into a little bit of trouble. I know it don't look like I would have done that, but I got into a little bit of trouble in school. And when I reflect back on what was at the root cause of it, I can remember times where I was overlooked. I can remember times raising my hand and get a chance to read. I can remember times where I didn't get the benefit of the doubt in the class dynamics with other students and others. I can remember times that I felt invisible. And though I was 10, 11 years old, perhaps, you know, there was a certain part of my being that registered that I did not matter. After receiving a lot of these kinds of treatments or reactions or responses to me, that I didn't matter. And I can remember really checking out. And I did that as I had learned that very young, very young. So fast forward to life, and I think about the ideas of people feeling overlooked, invisible, not being heard, you know, not having a voice in very important matters of life. After this runs its course for a period of time where it becomes normal, then people do what I did at 10 and 11 years old. They check out. They check out. I think we think about faith communities and what can we do. I think one of the most affirming things that we can do is make certain that people who we speak to, that we minister to, that that they feel seen, and they feel heard, and they feel responded to. And then we begin to get a response when we're talking about whether it's voters' rights or clean water or equitable education, right? Whatever the subject is really doesn't matter, because the foundation has been set already that I will be heard, I will be responded to, I will be acknowledged. And so I think that when I think about what can we do as faith communities, I think we have to be that the one who initiates that kind of engagement, so that people feel that way. And then I think as a natural consequence of that, I think people will respond to very important things in life, because it becomes very easy to disconnect, very easy to disengage. And I can remember being on the punitive side of things, because I did check out. I wasn't responsive, and it was always something wrong with me. I had to be fixed, you know that? I was broken, and I needed to be fixed. And one of the last things I would say is that at that age, after suffering what I would call abuse in that moment, I couldn't articulate, I couldn't really give voice to what my pain was all the time. I just knew this space wasn't for me. So in doing that, I think we have to create these safe spaces. I think we have to be very intentional about what we do and how we engage others. And then people will naturally, I believe, I'm an optimist, people will naturally respond better to these very important issues in life.
I sit in so many conversations where people ask, how do we speak prophetically to this time? Rabbi brought up the prophets used to stand on the street corners. There's so much in our world that needs a prophetic voice. And it's really hard. It's hard when the world seems like it's on fire, when there's issue after issue after issue to speak prophetically to. And one of the things that I feel like I've really been leaning into in my work is asking, how do we do this on a multitude of levels? Sometimes it is this stand on the street corner. Sometimes it's, for me, put on this fancy collar and go down to the Capitol in Madison and speak prophetically to our legislators and say, stop causing harm. But sometimes it's in those small places. It's in our communities. If we are people of faith, we are part of different communities. It might be our temple or our mosque or our church or wherever it is, that we are part of a community. And sometimes having a conversation with people you disagree with, getting into the really complex, hard conversations to say that this isn't just this or that issue. There's a whole spectrum in between. And to try to it's either take off all our identities and our labels, or maybe it's add 6 more labels to our labels to say that we're really complex people. We don't all agree. And so I think a lot about how do we have these prophetic one-on-one conversations? How do we build those relationships with each other that push us in new ways? And then how do we, I think one of the things we are called to do is to reach within our communities, but then to reach out to other people. To say, you know what, on paper, we're not supposed to agree. We're not supposed to be on the same side. But my faith calls me to love you. My faith calls me to love everybody. And so we need to reach out, and it might not be a prophetic public conversation. It might be something that happens in a coffee shop or behind closed doors. But those are also important. And so I think there's just a lot of really hard work ahead of us.
So thinking about that hard work, like you had mentioned, conversations, coffee shops, like what does that hard work, what can that hard work look like for you?
She's on a roll.
Well, so I am part of a Christian denomination that recently went through a very public breakup. And I have a good colleague he has remained part of our denomination, but he and I disagree on many things, and we get together and talk, and he's been pushing me. So I've gotten multiple emails to be like, hey, you said you were going to reach out to that other person that has now left your denomination, and if you really feel called to this peacemaking work, go get coffee with him. Go talk to him. Again, we're not going to fix it overnight, but this is someone that I've known for years, and so he emailed me just last week and said, hey, have you reached out to them yet? And I said, yep, you're right. I need to do that. It's hard, it's uncomfortable, but if I believe that my faith calls me to love my neighbor, it's what I need to do.
You know, I was thinking about when you mentioned a book that I had our team read, the One Minute Manager. You probably maybe have heard of that book. It was very well known in terms of business and nonprofit leadership. And there was one point that they used a tactic. It was like, you know, catch them doing good. It was catch them doing something good, right? So it was the idea is that we're very, very drawn to pointing, critiquing someone. Oh no, that's wrong. Oh no, that's that kind of thing. But the idea was to catch someone doing it when they actually do something of merit of good, regardless of you know, I don't have to agree with you, you know, 99% of the time, right? But the idea that I registered that was good, that was a good contribution. And we use it as a strategy in terms to really to building community within our organization, right? So I think that if I could just borrow that, you know, and put it in our context, you know, there are folks that we disagree with fiercely on political positions and so on and so forth. But if we're honest with ourselves, that the vast majority of people, if we look keenly enough and look intentionally enough, we can catch people doing good things. And we recognize people as they are actually offering, committing something. Say, listen, I saw that. I read these things and I wanted to send you a note. Now, it's coming from a person that they clearly know that we don't wear the same color uniform, right? But nonetheless, that does not stop me from reaching across and acknowledging something. I think that shows a level of humanity. That shows a level of being authentic with someone that I don't have to agree with to recognize good. Because we are very, we have a tendency, let me speak, I have a tendency, we have a tendency, I gotta use my I statements more than telling me, use I statements more. I have a tendency to, it can get black and white. When the work gets hard, it gets really black and white. I'm all good, you're all bad. And that's never the reality. That's never the reality. So if we practice catch them when they're doing good, I'm going to borrow that, so to speak, I think that may be a way that we can approach folks that we differ with, that we disagree with. But we also recognize they do some good.
When we think about some of the work that we do, I think that all of us have a responsibility in being the one that reaches out to somebody or builds that trust, that rapport, because each and every one of us has different communities or a different person. Somebody that Pardeep may be able to reach, right? It may not be somebody you can reach, or vice versa, that you can reach somebody that I cannot reach. Some of this work is internal, some of this work is external. And that was some of the difficulty that we had in the community sort of after the shooting happened, was that there was a lot of people within our community who were going through what's known as communal trauma. And what communal trauma will do at less of an individual level, but much more at a communal level, will say, shut down, isolate, retreat. And when you have people echo chamber, like somebody saying to somebody else, right? And I very, very, very much remember the conversations in the aftermath of hate, which looked like, why do all white people hate us? You see, I told you they hate us. And all of the sort of the sickness that comes with division and harm, right, is reinforced by somebody who's saying, I want to terrorize you. And it takes you all really leaning on your individual faith and communal faith to say, no, here's what I know, and here's who we are, and really fight for that. And when I say external work, the external work also exists all at the same time. So as a cynic, oftentimes I don't speak in dichotomies, I speak in duality, right? It's not this or that, it's usually this and that. It's not nature or nurture, it's nature and nurture, right? It's not just internal work, we also have external work that we need to do, which hopefully we commit to after we leave our place of worship, right? The external work for me over the past 12 years, and Rabbi Bonnie kind of reminded me of this with thinking about, even thinking about that person, that shooter, that 20-year-old shooter in Pennsylvania. And I know that people were looking for a lot of justification of what was the ideological leanings. So for the past 12 years, I've worked with nearly 100 people, kind of just like that shooter. Between the ages of 16 to 25, usually white males, but sometimes they're black males, sometimes these are Muslim males, sometimes there are other ethnicities and religions. And I could tell just by seeing that person, right? I could just kind of look at and say, this person doesn't really have a political leaning that they're really, really bought in for. What this person wants is the same thing that we all want, is to be heard, is to be understood. And I learned that from studying the shooter that came into the Gurdwara that day. When we step back and say, you know what, let me understand something, it doesn't mean that we condone it. It doesn't mean that we sympathize and say it's okay. But we as a society equip ourselves to do something about it. And so, yeah, this young man wanted the same thing that a lot of people want, which is to be understood, which is to be recognized. And unfortunately, what's happening right now in our society is that some of these young men who may or may not be on the spectrum, I can't diagnose them from kind of just on the TV screen, but sometimes they get into what's known as obsessional thinking of power. And this obsessional thinking of power says, I see somebody who has power and I want to do this so I can have that same amount of power. And we're obsessed in a society, we're kind of in a society where somebody thinks that power over somebody else is power. And what we have to go back to claiming is no, power with somebody is power. And that's a lot of the external work.
So when we talk about holding difficult conversations and reaching across ideologies, I have to always remind myself not to make assumptions. When my husband and I, we're both rabbis, when we were first ordained, we moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere, Virginia, very much Christian coalition country. And the very first thing that happened, we lived in this little town called Stanton, Virginia. And in the Stanton newspaper, we've been there for a couple of weeks, and the Stanton Daily Leader, the front page above the fold had this screaming headline, "Field of Blood being consecrated on Sunday." The Field of Blood, there was a Foursquare Gospel Church on the highway between Stanton and Charlottesville, and they had this big field that overlooked the highway, and the pastor had 4,400 little white crosses planted, I guess, on this field with a white picket fence and a big billboard overlooking the highway that said, "Field of Blood, 4,400 babies killed in America every day." And this was supposedly the number of abortions that happen in America every day. And in the newspaper article, which read like an advertisement for the Field of Blood, it said that one of the things that the pastor did was he was encouraging women who'd had abortions to come to the church and purchase for $1 a little brass plaque that could be put on one of these crosses with with the name of the aborted fetus. And this was supposed to be a place where they could come for comfort and forgiveness and healing. So a number of the clergy and mental health experts in town, under the leadership and advice of the local Planned Parenthood, we got together and we formed the Shenandoah Friends of Planned Parenthood to counter this narrative. And we worked in pro-choice spaces for several years, and the pastor kept promoting this place as a place of healing. And after a couple of years, the policy director from Planned Parenthood said to me, you know, we should really go meet with this pastor and talk to him and find out where he's coming from. And I was like, okay, that's a complete waste of time. He's not going to listen to us. He doesn't care what we think. He's very entrenched in his ideology. But sure, fine. I happened to have been 8 months pregnant at the time, so it made a good visual. So we met with him. He was very open to meeting with us. He was very open to hearing what we had to say. And we talked to him about, from a faith perspective, why we as people of faith believed in people's right to make their own personal health and reproductive health care decisions. And we talked about why this message of needing forgiveness was not helpful and was rather guilt-inducing and anxiety-producing and was actually doing more harm than good. And he listened. And by the end of the meeting, he said, I kind of see what you're saying, and I think I'm going to stop. And I was blown away that he really took in what we were saying. And I have found that that has been the case. Not every time. You're not always going to convince everybody. Sometimes difficult conversations do end up being a waste of time. But it's always astonishing to me the times when somebody says, you know, I never thought of it that way. Whether it's around reproductive justice, or whether it's around LGBTQ rights, or whether it's around immigration, or whether it's around climate change, all the different issues that we care about. You know, we talk about, you know, there's people in the extremes, we can't reach them, we're not going to reach them. We need to pitch our conversations to that mushy middle, the people who aren't decided, who haven't given deep thought to this issue yet, who haven't made up their minds yet. And that's true, we do need to reach those people, but I think we also can't discount that sometimes there are people we think are unreachable, and they end up to be very reachable.
That makes me think of unveilings. That information and like sharing with one another and being in space together lifts veils and reveals things that we didn't know before. And so we're now going to the time of individual panel questions. And so, Rabbi Bonnie, you have, I feel like you read my notes. So this first question is for Reverend Breanna, thinking about unveilings. So I'm going to use the term apocalypse, but I'm using the term apocalypse not in the Hollywood end of the world sense.
There's no zombies.
There are no zombies in this apocalypse. But looking at an apocalypse at the Greek root of the word, which means unveiling, which means revealing. And so, Reverend Breanna, you have talked about being a chaplain to the apocalypse, not the zombie apocalypse, but this scriptural sense of apocalypse. Going back to this meaning of unveiling, and what does unveiling look like in this election season? And so what does it mean to be engaged with peace building and accompanying people in the midst of unveilings and revealings?
I think, there we go. I was even thinking about this when Rabbi Bonnie was talking of, I think so often we get stuck in kind of, you know, the way we've always done things. If anyone's ever spent time in, I don't know about your communities, but I know in the church, we've always done things that way. We get stuck, and we've actually been in this big conversation in some of my circles about the fact that we say we are people of faith, we say we believe in God, but we don't actually seem to believe that God can move. We don't trust enough that reaching across that extreme aisle, that something could change. And so I think for us, we're called to live in a space where we believe that God can move. We believe that miracles can happen. We believe that something big can change. And I think that's something that we as people of faith bring to the table. We don't just bring theories and kind of white papers. We bring faith. We bring this idea that we're not alone in this work. There is, whatever your tradition is, there's often this idea that there is something bigger than us. In my tradition, we talk about God. We talk about the power of Christ. We say that there is this spirit that can move amongst us. And so what does it mean for us to be open to that spirit? To be listening? Where are those nudges? Where are those places that we've kind of had our eyes closed, where we've not listened? We talk about this idea of chaplains to the apocalypse, and we actually just got stickers printed. And it's been great because I sit in these conversations sometimes with emergency management, or we've been preparing for whatever may happen in our world around the election, and they get a little dark sometimes. We get extreme, and we sometimes go to these dark places of what happens if. And sometimes when I found myself in these really dark spaces, it's gotten heavy, we've kind of reached the bottom, I will look at the person I'm talking to and I'll say, well, congratulations, you've earned your chaplains to the apocalypse sticker. And it helps lighten it a little bit, but it's also real. Because there's so much in our world that sometimes we need to go to that place that's a little foreboding, that place that is scary, to see what's on the underside. We really started talking about this idea of the apocalypse and being a chaplain to the apocalypse during the pandemic, during the racial uprisings of 2020. The reality is racism has always existed. Our healthcare system has always been not great. And in 2020, it was unveiled in new ways. It was an apocalypse. And so what are we invited to do in an apocalypse? It's not grab a gun and take off, as they do in the movies. It's to say, well, where is God calling me? Where am I being led? How am I called to respond to this racism that I've seen in a new way? To this disconnection in community that I see in a new way? And so I think that's what we are called to do, is to constantly be asking, what is being unveiled to us? What are we seeing in a new way? And how do we pivot? How do we do something new? Because what we've always done isn't working. It's not working, it's very clear. And so we need to do something else. We need to step into new places and listen to where the Spirit, whatever word you may use to describe it, where we are being called.
Thank you. Imam Makram. One of the ways faith in public life is creating a different narrative, leading to tactile action, is through the Peacemaker program, where faith leaders play an active role in protecting the sanctity of our vision of democracy and the integrity of our democratic infrastructure. In leading a masjid for several years with a diverse population, how can faith-rooted peace builders from different traditions and different lived experiences move from words to concrete action as peacemakers?
I was just thinking about in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered in the cities of our streets, or the streets of our city. And the reaction of so many, not only in Minneapolis, but really worldwide, because of that. I mean, that horrific incident that happened that really it jolted us. It took whatever we knew to another level. Whatever we thought we knew, there was no hiding behind any veil of we couldn't put blinders on anymore, right? So you think about apocalypse, it's almost like a judgment day of sorts, right? And a number of things happened that some good, some bad, but I think as my takeaway of this is, and even in what we're facing today is, it appears to me that as peace builders, as faith traditions, there are a couple of things that we need to do. One is be in conversation the way that we are right now. And why is that so important? I think that we have to model a way forward and never really lose the responsibility that we have to lead. You know, leaders lead. Leaders lead, especially in difficult moments. It's very, you know, when the sun is shining and everything is great, it's great to be the leader at that point. But when it's raining and the power is out and you know, flights are delayed, all these kind of things, right? You know, it's very challenging to do that in that moment, but that's exactly when leaders have to lean in and lead. So I feel like this is part of that conversation. And if we study movements, the history of movements in this country, worldwide, but in the history of our country, we know that they always started with a few. They always started with a few. It was never the masses. The masses came as they, you know, some people are, they call them trailblazers or forerunners, you know. They're able to, you know, they don't need the road to be paved to travel. You know, they're willing to rough the terrain to get to a certain, you know, but the others like, let me wait till they clear the brush and, you know, I'll come behind it, and others like, hey, they got to come and pave those roads before I even venture off. Okay, so we can pick and choose where we are in that scenario, right? But I think that from a faith community, we have to be willing to rough the terrain. We have to be willing to do that and to keep the North Star as being our guiding post. But at the same time, understand that the journey is it's challenging. It said that, you know, if it was easy, everybody would do it. Just think about that. If the way was easy, everybody would be lining up to do it, but it's not. It's not that. So I think when I think about interfaith and dialogue and other things, and it's not just that, forgive me, the kumbaya moments. It's not just about that. I'm the same, you're the same. We're not the same. We are absolutely not, but that's the point. That's absolutely the point, right? So the idea that we can see the humanity in each other and really explore and be curious about one another and ask difficult questions. And in this, the last point of this conversation, that this interfaith is about, you know, sometimes we have a tendency to think that they just need more information. If I could just give them more information, that'll bring them over to my side. So I have to explain and re-explain and repackage and reframe until I'm exhausted. And quite frankly, they're tired of listening to me too. Right? Sometimes it's not even a matter, it's a matter of just saying, you know what, I understand your point. I understand your premise, and the story that you told me, where you're going. I understand what it's that I just disagree with the conclusion. So that we have to be ready for that. And we have to be mature enough to do that, but still curious enough to hear the story. The other thing that I think that happens is we need to do something tangible. We need to do something tangible. Again, you know, offering something that is a tangible manifestation of what we are those people, right? So, you know, you look at your environment. You know, for us, it's, you know, food insecurity is a big issue. So we cross bounds and we come together. We do things to feed people, that not only just to make sure people are nourished and have something nutritious. That's one level of it. But we're really bearing witness. We're telling the truth with our actions. We're being truth tellers without saying a word, right? I said I would rather see a sermon than hear a sermon any day. It's that idea. It's like, yeah, I hear you, but show me something, right? And then last but not least, I think, one of the biggest contributions we can make is dealing with conflict resolution. What does our tradition say about dealing with conflict? How do we process? How do we know this is just not semantics? And we argue for 10 hours and because I said this but I really meant that, but you thought I meant this and then. How do we get beyond those kinds of things that we waste a lot of time with and we actually process this is an actual conflict and getting through a conflict? Because life is full of it. Life's full of it, right? My wife and I pulled into the theater the other day and she wanted to see one thing, I wanted to see something else. We had a conflict. Now she wins the conflicts most of the time. I want to think her logic is stronger than mine most times. But nonetheless, we have an exercise, right? But the idea is if we're able to model these things and offer them and make it a part of our ministry, I'm not talking about that thing over there. Bring it center. Bring it center. And then I think we're making a contribution.
It's so tribal, like 2024. And I get it. When growing up, most of the people on this panel, right, maybe have grown up in a time where you and I would be given some assignment from our teacher, and they would say, okay, Pardeep, give me a report on World War I. And we would go and we would get an Encyclopedia Britannica or the 2 books that we had, and we would expand on our knowledge. Right? Fast forward to today, we have so much information that is going around in the minds of people. And they think that they have figured it out because of the influx of so much information. There's no shortage of somebody who asks me every single day, have you read this? Have you seen this? Have you seen this data? And I'm like, nah, I haven't. I'm kind of busy parenting. Or I'm busy doing this or busy doing that, right? But people just have so much information right now, but yet they don't have imagination. Right? People have so much information, yet they don't have faith. Like courage, or just the ability that something is walking with all of us. After the shooting happened, and we talked a little bit about this, but I saw so many children inside the temple, including my own daughter, who was 6 at the time. Right now, she's over at Madison. She'll be a freshman here next year. But so she's now almost 19, but she was 6 at that time. And just in this place of, I know they don't like me. I know they hate us. I have all this information that tells me that they hate us. And over time, just getting them and getting our own community. That's what the past, people ask me, what was the past 12 years about? Why is it that you work with former or current white supremacists? Because if we don't do it, if we're not the people that go out and say that we can do that work, then how can we ask our kids to do that work? Fast forward to 12 years later, my daughter was able to do a spoken word. And in this spoken word, she ended off and she spoke to the shooter in our situation. And as she says at the end of the talk, she says, you didn't hate us, you hated yourself. Right? Directly to the white supremacists, right to Wade Page, the people who we think are hating. And I think that that's a lot of what separates us from our oneness, is that sometimes that hate that either we feel about somebody else or we feel about ourselves. And we all have a little bit of that. And so for me, it's just, we don't see those connections because hate is too visceral.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for that response. Rabbi Bonnie, in our conversations, you had mentioned the Jewish High Holy Days, and that the call of the shofar is to awaken sleeping souls. And this may be a time where sleeping souls need to be thinking about that shofar blast, especially in times of heightened political violence. What are the ways that different faith traditions can awaken to one another's humanity and to put their intentions, once they're awake, to put those intentions into action when it comes to peace building?
So I always start with Jewish values, and there are 4 particular Jewish values that I want to lift up today. And the first always is B'Tselem Elohim, the belief that we are all created in God's image, that we are all endowed with basic human worth and dignity, and we always have to start there. And when we think about people who are on the other side of the ideological spectrum, we always have to remember their inherent humanity and that it is the same as ours. Pikuach nefesh, saving a life, is the highest value in Judaism. We are allowed to break every other commandment if we need to do so in order to save a life. And one of the most important observances in Judaism is Shabbat, is the Sabbath day, a day of no work, a day of complete rest. But if it is necessary to save a life, we're allowed to break Shabbat in order to do so. Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, is foundational to who we are as Jews, and particularly in my movement of Reform Judaism. It is our obligation to engage in acts of social justice. We are partners with God in the ongoing work of creation. In Genesis 1, God creates the world, God looks at the world, and God says, it's very good. And then God says to Adam, to the first human being, you have dominion over this world. And dominion is the word that is very often used in many translations. But another translation is steward. Not that you have power or control over the world, but that the world is in your care. And it is your obligation to return the world to God in the perfect condition that God gave it to us. And that's our job. God's job is done. God created the world. Now it's up to us. And the fourth value, the value of kihila, the value of community and relationships. That everything we don't do in a vacuum, we don't do on our own, but we do in community, and we do for our community, to build our community. We're in a time now when people are inclined to give in to fear and to despair. And in times like these, I think about the words of the labor organizer Joe Hill, when he was facing the death penalty for a murder that he did not commit. And he wrote to a fellow labor organizer and he said, don't mourn, organize. And he recognized that the antidote to despair is action. The organization I founded, Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, is an interfaith advocacy organization committed to a wide range of social justice initiatives. In 2019, we formed the Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign, and it had 2 goals, and it still has those 2 goals. And the first goal is to get people out to vote, to focus on voter education, voter registration, get out the vote, to safeguard our right to vote, to fight against voter suppression, to fight for fair maps. But the other goal is to build community among different faith groups. So the work that we do is through congregations, through clergy, through people of faith, and we work to bring them together across faith traditions to do this work together. John Lewis said the right to vote is sacred, and we believe that. And we also believe that clergy and faith communities are trusted messengers. There are places where people go for comfort, for community, for fellowship, for connection to the divine, to something greater than themselves. But it's also a place where we go to figure out how we can work together to make this world a better place. And through direct action is one of the ways that we do that. One of the Wisconsin Faith Voter Engagement Campaign's signature programs is our Poll Chaplain program. And we recruit clergy and people in faith leadership positions around the state. We work with some of provide active bystander and de-escalation training. And on election day, we send them to polling places, not to pray, not to proselytize, not to sing, but just to be there, to be a peaceful presence, to be that pastoral, calming, non-anxious presence that will help, hopefully, to keep the voters feeling calm, feeling comfortable, feeling safe, feeling secure as they wait in line to vote. We started this in 2020, we expanded in 2022, we hope to expand further this year. After the first time we did it in Madison in 2020, I asked Mary Beth Wurtzebel, our Madison city clerk, so Mary Beth, you know, we did this thing, and did it help? Should we do it again? And she said, you know what? We'll never know what didn't happen because you all were there, but we do know that our poll workers felt better knowing that you were there. The atmosphere has gotten even more fraught in the last 4 years, and poll workers are feeling more and more under the gun, in some cases literally. And so to have clergy, to have faith leaders, to have that pastoral presence out there is so important. And to have all of us working together to do canvassing, to provide rides to the polls, to do phone banking, importantly to counter misinformation and disinformation. Pardeep talked about our information overload. Some of that information is false. Some of it is deliberately false. Some of it is people just unknowingly and innocently sharing and passing on information that they think is true, but it isn't. So it's part of our obligation as people of faith to be judicious consumers of information and to be careful what we pass along, to know that what we're passing along comes from objective sources, from verifiable sources, from trustworthy sources. Psychologists tell us that taking direct positive action reduces anxiety, it builds resilience, it builds mental health, and when we do it together with others, it builds a sense of community. And it reminds us that we are all in it together in this enterprise of protecting human American democracy. So that's something that we are all leaning into and working toward and hoping to find continues after 2024.
Thank you, Rabbi Bonnie. And thank you, panelists, for answering these individual questions. There is a second question for all of you. And this question feels more and more pertinent right now, especially with what happened on Saturday, because thinking about trauma responses and thinking about collective trauma responses. How do we engage people that are responding out of trauma responses with mutual accountability while also holding that line on not dehumanizing and separating out by othering?
In psychology, we have a term called stress diathesis model, which means kind of, it's like stretch the rubber band without breaking it, is what it's likened to. And this happens at, again, at an individual level. This happens at a communal level. Going back to the example that kind of provided in the aftermath of the shooting, there was a lot of community members who would oftentimes vilify me because I would bring white people into the Gurdwara, into the temple. Sometimes I would bring tattooed white people in there. And they would pull me aside and say, Pardeep, why do you keep bringing in all those white people? And I was like, I'm sorry. I didn't even try to like explain it. I was like, I'm sorry. I apologize. Right? Then it would happen again, and I would do it again. And like, well, you're so sorry. You did it again. I'm like, yeah, I'm sorry again. I apologize. Like, don't you understand that you're scaring the children? Don't you understand that you're scaring all of us? You're making us have to relive the trauma. I'm going to share a quick story about when I was policing. When I was policing the inner city of Milwaukee. And sometimes we didn't have, and I'll clean this story up, literally. We didn't have restrooms to kind of go to at certain times of night, but we did have abandoned houses. And sometimes you go into some abandoned houses that's been abandoned for, maybe 5 years, and you need to relieve yourself. So you go to the restroom. And now you got your flashlight out, you go to the restroom, and you go look in the toilet. And in the toilet, they got what's known as like hardened poop. That's hardened to the top of the toilet. But you need to relieve yourself. Right? So what I would do is I'd, use the bathroom. I did, piss on dry poop, basically. I know this is being recorded and it's okay. But I would piss on dry poop. And all of a sudden, if you piss on dry poop, guess what happens? That stench just comes up and hits you right in the nose. But I needed to relieve myself. Right? So I had to sit there through that stench of everything that comes up when we try to do that work known as communal trauma. Right? And we sit there. But somehow, some way, that toilet has to get clean. Somehow, some way, we have to do the work. I oftentimes tell people or clients that I'm working with, I am going to bug you. I'm going to irritate you, and then I'm going to apologize. And I'm going to mean it. I'm sorry for having to drag you through what you have gone through. But if we don't do it, we don't get nowhere. As a society, if we don't do the work, right? If we just have our coping mechanisms of life, which becomes either, apathy, I don't matter, my voice doesn't matter, why participate in this voting election, why, everything, all the maladaptive coping mechanisms that people use, I glaringly see. Because everything that calls upon you to control your environment, that's a maladaptive coping mechanism. Yes, it can also be healthy too. To say, I don't want to talk about it right now, can be healthy. I don't want white people to come into our Gurdwara, can be healthy. And I said, how can this next generation of kids who are terrorized of white people exist in a white country, right, and become the next doctor, lawyer, police officer, what have you? And so that was my fear of, we're going to lose an entire generation because of terror. And that's not going to happen. That's not the America that we work so hard, and we all work so hard to make happen. But yeah, doing this work is like pissing on dry poop sometimes. I'm in a religious thing.
That imagery is just I'm trying to work with it here. I think one of the things that appears to me in this moment is this idea of how faith has to engage in science, in social science, right? And understanding the psychology of human beings, and take that into account as we're ministering to people and as we're being faith practitioners, if you will, right? The idea that we have these ideals in our traditions about what we should be. We have and how we should be showing up, and they're true. They're true. They're our North Star, if I can use that term again. That's where we're going. But then we have people we have to meet where they are, right? And part of our work is trying to close the gap between where people are and where that North Star is. Not necessarily that they would always touch it, or they would always become it. They, meaning we will always become it. But the idea is that if we can get a little closer, my wife, she works works on the Minneapolis school board, and you know, when they talk about reading score, they measure growth versus just, you know, what level they're at, what was the growth, you know, where did they start, where are they at, those kinds of things. I think that even taking an approach like that, even in our faith work, I think is really important. Just so we can understand it's not an all or nothing situation, because it would be very, very easy to have a traumatic experience and then I just basically shut down to that for the rest of my life. Actually, I just never revisit that traumatic situation that caused me that trauma. I mean, I can see that's where that goes, and unfortunately, people have lived that life. They've lived and died, never really going back to that place anymore because it wasn't safe, that they didn't have the tools, etc. I think part of our work is helping to facilitate that growth, to facilitate that level of growth. You know, it's one thing to be on one side of the river and telling people who's on the other bank, on the other side of it, you need to be over here. You're supposed to, God wants you over here, right? But it's another thing to send a boat. It's another thing to build a bridge so that they can cross, so they can get near over to that idea, but to simply hold up these ideals without giving a means to do that, facilitating means to do that, I think that we're doing a disservice then. I think in our traditions, I think we really are. So, I mean, maybe that's not directly addressing, but I think the idea that, you know, how do we deal with these you know, these very hard things that people experience in life that do cause trauma, but at the same time, the idea of how do we show, so be empathetic in those moments, but then also there's a level of accountability. I can't do the work for someone else. We can point in the direction, we can facilitate, we can coach, we can mold, we can minister, we can do all these things, but we can't do for people. We can't do that. That's a reality also we have to grapple with as well, because sometimes in our work, those lines get gray. And sometimes we actually think we can do. And that's a dangerous space to be in.
The Jewish community has been living with generational trauma for 4,000 years. In 2017, Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice formed the Dane Sanctuary Coalition, and we talked to the congregations that were thinking about becoming sanctuary sites, host sites to host somebody in sanctuary who was at imminent risk for deportation. And I would talk to the leaders of those 6 congregations, 3 buildings, that were thinking about doing this work and that eventually did sign on to be the host congregations. And in talking to them about what it would mean to have somebody in sanctuary, the congregations, almost all of which were Christian congregations, said, oh, so one of the things that we're going to have to do is keep our doors locked. And I said, welcome to my world. It was always, it never fails to astonish me the number of churches that I can just walk into. You can't do that at a synagogue. It does not happen. Our doors are locked. Every Friday night, Temple Bethel, the Reformed Synagogue here, has off-duty armed, uniformed police guards at our front door for Friday night services, for Shabbat morning services, for religious school on Sunday, for Hebrew school on Wednesday, and any time that there's any kind of public gathering. And our kids have to walk by armed, uniformed police in order to go to Hebrew school and religious school, and for us to come to services. And we have to explain to them why they're there. They're there to keep us safe, because there are people who want to kill us. That's a terrible thing to have to tell a 6-year-old. But it's the reality we live with. There has been an exponential rise in anti-Semitism in the last 5 years, no more so than in the last 9 months. There's also been a very frightening rise in Islamophobia. Our communities have to work together. We have to build bridges. We have to come together for mutual understanding, for mutual protection. We have to see the humanity in each other. Here in the United States, the Jewish community has been able to flourish in a way that it has not in any other time in our history, in any other place where Jews have lived in our history. We've been able to participate in the public sphere in a way that we have not any place else that we have lived in our history. And it's because of democracy. It's because of the rule of law. It's because of the separation of church and state. It's because of the right to free speech. It's because of the right to protest peacefully. These are all the cornerstones of the American experiment. And it's incumbent upon all of us to work together to protect those essential freedoms. And fundamental to this is having free and fair elections that we can trust, and the peaceful transfer of power after an election. And we have to hold our leaders accountable to protect these values and to protect these democratic systems, and not to stoke fear and stoke anger with irresponsible rhetoric that builds on those fears, and not to use their positions of power to undermine our trust in democratic institutions. We have to rebuild trust in the idea that government is actually here to help us. We have to trust that our media provides us with objective and reliable and fact-based information. We have to trust that schools and universities are safe spaces that model respectful dialogue and critical thinking. And we have to rebuild the idea that our local communities are places where people of different faiths and different backgrounds can come together for a common purpose to make everybody's lives better with equal opportunity and equal respect. This election is a pivotal moment for these fundamental rights and values. And we have the opportunity to work together as faith communities, as communities committed to justice, to protect that democracy. Tru'ah and the Jewish community remain committed to protecting the sacred right to vote and to ensuring that all votes are counted and all voices are heard. And we really encourage and look to our fellow faith leaders to work with us toward those goals.
I was thinking about, in answering this question, I was thinking about my Methodist tradition. And then Pardeep was talking about poop, and I'm leaning further into my Methodist tradition. The Methodists talk about being bile, so I'm with you, my friend. But I was actually thinking of some of my colleagues who have talked in this image. One you may know, Reverend Tyler Sitt from Minneapolis. It talks about composting. And there's a community in Dallas, Union, who talks about all the shit in the world. I hope I'm allowed to say that.
I don't want to say it.
I broke the barrier. Because what Bonnie just listed, the fact that kids have to walk past people with guns to be safe is shit. Like, our world, there is some shit in our world. And it is crass, and it is vile. And I'm going to use vile language. But one of the things that I believe is that, and Union, this community talks about, is the idea that God can take all of this shit and make it holy. God can renew this world. Tyler talks about composting. We take all of this shit and make it holy. God takes it. And I was thinking about this composting image, and even your image a little pretty, but like, I love compost. Maybe it's because my dad's a soil scientist and I love dirt. But one of the things about compost is it needs to be aerated. You need to turn it. You need to bring it to the light. We need to take all of this shit and start talking about it. I was thinking about talking about conflict. I'm a very conflict-averse culture. I am a white woman from northern Wisconsin. We don't do conflict. Look at where it's gotten us. It has gotten us to this world when we don't address the conflict, when we don't aerate the shit in our world, we are in a mess. And so I think one of our calls is to start aerating, start talking to people, to let the Spirit, again, however you may name that, to do that work and aerate it and have the hard conversations. It's gonna get stinky. Pardeep told us. It's gonna get nasty. It's gonna get messy. We're gonna come out, feel like we're gone through a war. But it is the only way for us to move to a different place.
Thank you. Thank you for those responses. We have time for a question or two from our audience. If there's somebody who has a question that they'd like to ask, Heather has the microphone.
We only take easy ones, by the way.
I'd like to go back to the idea that Pardeep introduced, this idea of imagination. That I think it's more important than we realize. That I know there was a Quaker sociologist by the name of Elise Baldwin, a scholar who talked about it's impossible for people to move forward in a direction that they don't envision. They don't have any idea what that would be like. So maybe something very relevant. We're getting close to the day that we commemorate the bombing of Hiroshima. And can we imagine a world without weapons? And this is actually a workshop she used to do, to get people to sit together and think about what would the world be like without any weapons, let alone nuclear weapons. And then, that's hard. I mean, it sort of catches you off guard because we're so used to weapons as being a source of our security and safety. But then she would back up and she'd say, well, what would need to happen 20 years from now for that to be a reality? And then you'd spend time thinking, what about 10 years? What do we need to do in the next 5 years to keep us on this process of eliminating weapons? And I think without those times of prophetic imagination, you could call it, we minimize the change we can make in the world. We'll say, well, that group of people never live together well. Or this could never happen. There's always going to be poor people in the world. It limits our potential, it limits our vision, it limits our faith. I think we need, as people of faith, to really think more about how do we nurture that ability to imagine in the holiest way.
I just think imagination and really holy imagination as we think about it, and that calls on us to see something that maybe isn't exactly informational, but much deeper to the core of who we are. And we do have this experiment that's happening within this earth that's going towards 8 billion, 9 billion plus people. And a lot of people sometimes say, well, what is that language that we need to speak? And typically for me, the way that I've been able to work with people who would identify in all kinds of different groups is to say, I don't really, and maybe this is a fault sometimes, but I don't really see, I don't really I hear what you're saying, but typically when I'm talking to a client or I'm like, why are they saying it? What's causing them to say it? I'm almost like, I don't really care as much when somebody's like, this is how I feel, this is what I believe, this is how I believe about you, and I'm like, and so what we have to do as a people is to imagine somebody past the sword that they hold in front of us, to see past the armor that they build in front of you, to see past all of that and as much as you may have been hurt and why you developed that armor and why you took on that shield to keep people away from you, I still am not going to lose my sense of compassion for you. And then people say, well, isn't that a kind of a Pollyannish way to like kind of exist and live? And I think it's more Pollyannish to live in the day-to-day separation of who we are. And in fact, I don't think we can do it. I don't think once we get to 8, 9 billion plus people, if we don't weaponize compassion and love and faith and imagination, we will cease to exist as a species, because that fundamentally to who we are, and no offense to animals or anything like that, but to have a state of consciousness around that is uniquely human. And we're losing our ability to be human.
Thank you for the really wonderful wisdom, practical and moral wisdom that you've shared. It is very helpful. For some reason, I kept thinking about something that Dr. Martin Luther King revealed to us in his 1967 speech at Riverside. While I was listening, he kept coming back to that. And that is, he pointed out how difficult it is to resist political violence within this country without also seeking to resist the political violence which our country is involved in all over the world. And he said, in that speech, he gave several reasons why he felt he had to take such a strong stand against the Vietnam War. One of them was, he didn't feel he could continue speaking about nonviolence to the young black men in the ghettos unless he confronted violence, the violence of our nation, which in that speech, he said, is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the connection between violence in this country and the violence that our country is supporting and practicing so many places in the world.
Well, I think part of the reality is this country was founded on violence. It is through the threads of unfortunately, through the threads of what is America. We started with violence, we started with colonization, and it just has continued through. And so I think sometimes that's also where I'm just reflecting on the previous question about imagination, because we are so entrenched in this idea that everything we do is steeped in violence. I also find myself thinking a lot about that violence is the easy answer. It's not easy, it's not, but it's I react with violence. I think about myself, if something bad happens, you feel it in your body even. Like, we want to react with violence. I get mad, I want to punch somebody. I shouldn't do that because I'd probably hurt myself more than I'd hurt them. But that's often who we are, and I think that's part, for me, I think about as a person of faith, it's when I am rooted in my faith. I am rooted in a message of love, of active nonviolence, of peace, of grace, of compassion. And it is a call to a different self. And so I think for us as faith leaders, that is also our call to say, hey, country, we are called to something different. If you use, my people have been causing a lot of problems lately in the Christian world. We've got the rise of Christian nationalism that say, well, this country was Christian and founded on Christian ideals. But those Christian ideals that people speak of are never grace and compassion and love and peace. And so I think for me as a Christian, part of my call is to say, if you're going to say that, I'm not going to agree with you necessarily, but at least think about that call to nonviolence. And let's think about what it means to love and to be rooted in peace. And so I think it's a really complex question. It's a really complex time. We are all I did not study this in seminary. I don't know if any of you did in any sort of education you had, but how do we just continue to come back to the roots of who we are and who we, like, what we are fundamentally called to? And I believe it's a call to peace.
I would only add to that, you know, a very intriguing question, very complex question, very layered question, you know, and I think that my mind just goes to the belief in our tradition, and perhaps a shared idea that, you know, we are not we don't control outcomes. We don't control outcomes. You know, we have a feeding program, for example, and we feed hundreds of seniors every week. And we have been and getting better at it and all this kind of thing, but for me to take as my charge to end world hunger is too big for me. But that does not give me an out not to do anything. It doesn't give me an out to just, since I can't solve world hunger, I'm going to sit down here and I'm just going to talk about how bad hunger is. No, we all have to act within our capacity. We have to act within our capacity to do what we know and believe in our heart through our traditions to be the right thing to do. Right? So I think that even this idea of violence, yes, violence is, you know, in this country, yes, but, you know, historically beyond the American experiment, there's been violence on this earth. There has been violence on this earth that predates America. So we have this as part of the history of the world as well that has gone on, and we know it's not something that we are to embrace just as our identity. Islam means peace. When you say Muslim, you're saying one who submits to peace. That's literally what you're saying every time. Oh, you're a Muslim. Oh, you're one who submits to peace. Literally, right? So the idea of understanding my faith identity is one to be a peaceful existence, but I know that fighting is a part of my history too. Right? So I think that we have these, we live at these intersections that are complex, that are difficult, but I think that, you know, I think that's where the moral compass comes into play. I mean, to do what we believe in our hearts and our mind based on our traditions as being the right thing, you know. And I would hope that, you know, we can have mature and dynamic conversations that's not zero-sum. You know what I mean? It's not really all or nothing. I think it pins us in, boxes us in too much, and it doesn't account for the human factor. It doesn't account for situations that go on, you know. And again, I'm no advocate for violence. I'm just understanding the human condition. And understanding that I have to persevere as a person of faith, even through the frailties of human condition.
Just the older I get, I know I'm not that old yet, but the older I get, the more that I think about just kind of just how war does go against the spirit of our Creator's creativity. And for us, I think we think about, you know, if God wanted to, God was powerful enough to make everybody look the same, walk the same, talk the same, dress the same, believe the same. But within the sort of, even the mosaic, as you look around at the different sort of ways in which it becomes beautiful, that's how we become beautiful, but also at the same time, that's how we have that realization of who we are. And the older I get, the more that I just feel like I've been fooled into certain identity and certain things that take me away from that take me away from who I am at my core. And that's maybe just a self, sort of like the older I get, the less I believe in certain things. But the more that I believe in that the heart of who we are, we have to be compassionate. We have to be uniquely human. And I think to think about even the recent conflicts, the recent things that are going on in the world, we don't actually get to a better place if until every white is fighting for every black, every man for woman, right? Jew for Muslim, Sikh for Hindu, Hindu for Sikh, Muslim for Jew. I think that's our unique call of this time, is to say, how do we get and not lose the imagination that we can get there? Because our current trauma is telling us that we can't. That information overload is telling us why we can't. Is to say, the older I get, the less I believe in. The more I'm imagining. And maybe Dr. King was at that place too. That he just gave it up to imagination or something else.
I don't really have a lot to add. Judaism says seek peace and pursue it. And yet, Judaism is not a pacifistic religion. We recognize that there are times when there is such a thing as a just war. We recognize that sometimes self-defense is necessary, and sometimes that involves violence. And I agree with the Imam, we can't put ourselves into boxes, because the world is too complex for that. And sometimes it's the only thing that you can do. World War II was a just war. Neville Chamberlain tried diplomacy with Hitler and it didn't work. Diplomacy doesn't work with homicidal maniacs. And that was reality. There was no other response that was going to keep the world safe. And sometimes that's true. And it's always tragic. And as soon as we can get past that and to a place where diplomacy will work, where peacemaking will work, that's what we have to lean into, and what the ultimate goal is. But a blanket statement that there just should never be any kind of violence in the world, it just is not the world we live in. It's not human reality.
If I may add one thing, you think about this issue of trauma and what goes on, and I think about, even my community over the last couple of years, I mentioned the murder of George Floyd and other things, as just being really a spark that got attention, but it's a reality that we've known for decades, if not centuries, right? One thing that dawns on me is that, the trauma that we experience is very real, but it doesn't always tell the truth. It doesn't always tell the truth. So sometimes if I'm responding to something through my trauma, that actually something happened to me, but if I'm responding through my trauma, sometimes, the glass is hazy. It's not always what I think it is. But it doesn't come from nowhere, it's come because I had a traumatic experience. But it's not always truth. It's not always telling me the truth. Not in that moment. So trauma, true, but it doesn't always tell me the truth. So sometimes I'm responding to something, it's like I'm fighting someone that's not even there anymore. I can experience some other things that are in my mind. It's happening to me, and in the moment it feels real, but there's no third-party verification. There's no third-party verification saying, no, that's not what's going on here. In my mind, in that moment, it was telling me, you have an enemy. They're against you. Nobody believes me. Nobody will trust. This country's not for me. And all my trauma can have me tell me things that isn't true. so I think that, again, as communities dealing with people who have been subjected to so much trauma, we have to also recognize that. We have to also recognize that too, that a person's traumatic experience does not equate everything that they're going through as being true. You know, as a person, as a black male growing up in urban America, I've experienced a lot of trauma. And it wasn't until I had a chance to experience things outside of my locals to say, wow, what I held to be a truth is actually not true. And I'm grateful to God that He gave me these experiences. He let me live long enough to have some experiences to debunk things that I had held as being true. Because my trauma kept telling me that's true. You're under attack. You're under a siege. You won't get a fair shake. You won't get a thing. Yeah, and I mean, it's arguably, but now I have experience that informs my trauma now. That allows me, as angry as I was, just to be quite transparent, as angry as I was growing, it would be hard to sit in a panel like this, peacefully, and have a conversation for an hour and a half, and let my imagination be curious about what could be, because in that moment my trauma would say, this is not safe. They're trying to get me. So I would be in a very defensive, I would be in a, and almost I may have to feel like I have to lash out. Because that's what my trauma was telling me. Even though they don't mean me any harm. So trauma is real, but it does not always tell us the truth.
Thank you for those responses and thank you for the questions. We are at time, and it's so hard because this is a conversation that can just keep going. And so I invite this conversation to keep going. Please join us for a light lunch in the fellowship hall downstairs, where we can continue on in having these hard conversations with one another, in wrestling together of what does it mean to be a peace builder and to be a peacemaker. And so thank you to each of our panelists for giving voice to peace building, to peacemaking, for being able to say hard things and have hard conversations. Thank you all to the audience for taking time out of your schedule to be here with us today, to listen, but also to engage, to embody, and to figure out how do we go from the panel and how do we embody what we've heard today. And again, I want to thank the Reverend Tim Schaefer for the use of this beautiful facility and this space. And so I encourage us to continue these conversations. I encourage us to continue to wrestle. I encourage us to make fertilizer. Thank you.
Thank you all. I don't know. Is it working? I have a soft voice. Okay, it's working. Thank you, Reverend Tuhina.